Alright guys, welcome back, and in the last video we were essentially just fixing up our breakcast hits and making sure that our enemies are getting hit and our masks are being ignored and so on and so forth. And in this video we want to start actually, essentially killing our zombies and also updating the score and thinking about our game over condition and our win conditions and so on and so forth. So I'll go ahead and switch over back onto the code. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of this debug line since essentially that was just for testing purposes. Okay, so when we hit the enemy collider, this is where we essentially take care of the code that we will run when we want to kill an enemy. So this is where we will kill enemy. Okay, and how exactly are we going to do that? So there's a couple of things that we want to happen when we click on an enemy, right? We want some concept of a score, and we then want to kill that enemy, and therefore we want to activate another enemy, and so on and so forth. And to do all of this stuff, we will jump back into our game manager, okay? So what we will do is, when we click here, we can create a function in our game manager class, and we can call that function from our player input class, okay? So for example, if I come here, just like our pick new zombie function, if you come over here, if this time if I create a public void, and let's call it kill enemy, and oops, okay, yeah. So if I create this function here, and let's go ahead and throw in a debug line in here, and we'll say kill enemy function called. Clearly I can't spell, but that's okay. Okay, alright, so the reason why I made this function public was because we're going to be accessing this function from another script, okay? So notice how this one here was private and we were only using it within the confines of this script, and that was okay. But because we're going to be calling this function from another essentially script on the same game object, we want to try and make it public so that it's a little bit more accessible, okay? So what we can do now is we can call that function from our player input script. Now if I jump back into Unity really quickly, and if I go on our game manager, notice how the game manager script and the player input script, they are both on the same game object, right? So if I minimize this, if I go back into my game manager, notice how both of these scripts are basically two components on the same game manager object, okay? And in that case, getting reference to the other script and the variables and the functions therein is relatively easy, okay? So what I can do is I can simply do something like game object dot get component, and I can search for the component game manager, which is the script, and inside it I'm looking for a kill enemy function, okay? So the kill enemy function is like so, okay? So what exactly did we do? This lowercase game object means it is a reference to this particular game object onto which this player input script is attached, okay? So whenever I write lowercase game object, I'm actually asking Visual Studios and Unity to give me the reference to the game object which has this player input script. In this case, that game object is this one here. Okay, once I have the reference to that game object, what I do is I call upon .getComponent, okay, and I'm saying, hey, on this game object, look for a component of the type game manager. Now this type game manager is a script that we have created ourselves, okay? So I tell it, hey, on this game object, look for a component, so cycle through all of the components. In this case it has three or four, but even if we had multiple, like let's say 10, 15, it would cycle through and it would check, hey, which one is the game manager, which one is the game manager, and until it would hit this game manager, it would then return that essentially component. Inside that component, we've created a function called kill enemy, which is over here, and we just have a simple debug line in here, and it says kill enemy function call. Now if all of this works out correctly, if I now save and if I jump back into Unity, and when I hit the play button, it's not going to look a lot different, but the kill enemy debug line, so notice how you see the kill enemy function called, that's actually being control being passed from this script, that is the player input script, onto the game manager script, okay? So that is progress. And if you're wondering why we're actually doing that, well, we don't have to do that. But the reason why I chose to do that is because the game manager is essentially my central manager. It's taking care of my zombies, it's taking care of spawning my zombies, and so on and so forth. And I also, in this case, made a decision that I wanted to keep things such as the score of the game or the state of the game, whether the game is over or if it's not over within my game manager. So because I want to keep those things in here, I felt that this was a good decision to do. So far we have made some progress. Now every time we kill an enemy, we want to increase our score. Okay, so let's scroll up here and let's create a new variable. So we can call it private integer, and we'll call it, let's see, zombies smashed. Okay, and what we'll do is when the game starts, we can go ahead and initialize that variable to 0. Okay, so we can say zombies smashed is equals to 0. Okay, and every time we kill a zombie, we can increase this variable. Okay, so essentially I can come here and I can say zombies smashed plus plus. Okay, if you're confused about what plus plus means, it basically means it adds 1 to the value of the current variable. Okay, so it is sort of kind of like the same thing as me saying, and this is going to look a little bit weird, but it's saying, hey, take zombies smashed, right, whatever the value is, add 1 into it, okay, and then equate all of that into a new value for zombies smashed, okay? So these two lines of code here essentially mean the same thing. It takes the existing current value of zombies smashed, adds 1 to it, and then saves it back in zombies smashed, okay? So we're gonna go ahead and leave it like so. So now we have increased our score. What we also want to do is now we want to kill the enemy and then activate a new one. Well, we already know how to activate a new one because we have this function called pick new zombie. But before we pick a new zombie, let's go ahead and put that in here as well, because eventually we'll pick a new zombie and the whole thing will start again. But over here we want to write the code for killing enemy, okay? And how can we do that? The way we can do that is basically, if you remember, when the zombie is going up and it's going down, we had saved its start position. So what we can do is the enemy that we want to kill, we can simply just snap it back to its start position. So whenever we click on the enemy, click, and we'll move it back into the start position, so it will warp back, and then we will activate a new zombie, okay? And add on top of that, when later on, if you want to add some, you know, particle effects or something like that, and then it'll look juicy and fun. So let's go ahead and do that. We know how to get the active zombies, so we have an array of zombies, right? And we know that we have an active zombie index, so this is going to give us the current zombie. And what we can do is we can say, hey, transform.position equals to start position. Okay, so essentially all we did here was we found out the active zombie and we said, hey, move its position to its start position. So let's say if our current zombie was, let's see. So let's say the zombie here is going up and down, and whenever we click on it, we just say, hey, move its position to its start position. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and move it back, and then we do, hey, pick new zombie. Okay, so I think this is looking relatively good. So if I hit, so I think this is looking really good so far, and if I hit the save button right now, and if we switch on back, and if we hit play, then we can see what happens, okay? So if I hit the play button, when I click on this, it disappears, and another one comes, and of course I get the debug line, and when I click on another one, and when I click on this, and so things seem to be working just fine. our, we seem to be smashing our zombies, and also our score is being updated as well. So really quickly, every time we kill the enemy, let's go ahead and actually look at our score as well to make sure everything is correct. So every time all of this happens, every time we increase our counter, let's go ahead and debug the score as well. And we can do that by simply putting in the zombies smashed integer in here. Okay, so if I save it now, when I go back here and I run the game, we should see every time that we smash a zombie, we're going to see the score in our debug log. So our score is 1, and it's 2, and it's 3, and the score seems to be updating as well. Now, lastly, what I want to do is I want to very quickly talk about, hey, we want an end condition as well. So arbitrarily, what I thought was if we miss 3 zombies, the game is going to be over, okay? And once again, we can do all of that logic essentially in our game manager. So over here at the top, I'm going to declare another variable, and I'll call it, I'll call it lives remain, okay? And I'm going to, in my start function, I'm going to say that lives remaining is equals to 3, okay? Because we just arbitrarily chose 3 as the number. Alright, so now that we have declared our lives remaining variable and we've initialized it at 3, we can think about where we're actually going to decrease our life. And the place where we want to think about decreasing our life is in the situation where the zombie is going down, and he's going down, and we haven't yet smashed him yet, and it's all the way down to its starting position where it had initially started. And we can think about that being in the is falling, and we can see here that when the transform position of the zombie is less than its starting position or equal to its starting position. So in this case, the zombie has essentially either gone to its starting position all the way back, or it's gone below its starting position. So at this point, it means that the zombie has gone through its full cycle and it has survived and not been smashed. And this is a good place for us to think about decreasing our life. So what we can do is we can do lives remaining and minus minus, just like we did plus plus. It essentially takes the value of lives remaining and it decreases it by 1. Okay, so that means it's going to decrease our value every time lives remaining. It means that it's going to decrease our value every time we miss a zombie, okay? And what we can also do here is that when this happens, we can quickly check the value of lives remaining, okay? We can say, hey, if lives remaining is equal to 0, because the first time we miss a zombie, it's going to go from 3 to 2. Then the next time when we miss it, it's going to go from 2 to 1. And the third time we miss our zombie, it's going to go from 1 to 0, okay? So if lives remaining is 0, then we can do a quick debug log here, and we can say, hey, it's time for game over, okay? So it's time for game over, okay? If I now save this change, and if I switch back to Unity, let me just make sure we got everything. And if I switch back to Unity now, and if you play the game, and let's see what happens. Okay, so this is the first zombie, and we're going to miss him. Let's see if I can increase the speed a little bit to 2. And all right, so fair enough. Over here, we see it's time for game over. So when we missed the third, essentially the third zombie, we got that error message. So that means that's working. What now we need to do is we need to start thinking about how we can, have a game over condition. So what we can do is we can go over here all the way at the top, and we can create a new Boolean variable. We'll call it private bool game over. And what we're going to do is at the start of the game, we're going to say that game over is essentially, it's false because the game is not over. Okay, but when this happens, when lives remaining equals 0, we can say, hey, game over is equals to true. So now we've set the variable game over. what we want to do is this right here is the entirety of our game, okay? This update loop is basically where all of the action is happening. So we want to run all of this if and only if our game is still currently running, i.e. if the game is not over, okay? So what I can do is I can come all the way here at the top of my update and I can put a big if condition and I can say, hey, check. If the game is not over, so by this exclamation mark, I'm switching it's a not sign. So basically I'm saying, hey, check if the game is not over, if the game over variable, essentially is not true, then what we want to do is we want to put all of this code here inside that if statement, okay? So we're going to go ahead and we're going to put it here like so, okay? So let me just quickly format this a little bit better. And okay, so let's see what's happening. When the game starts, right, game over is going to be false, right? And the first time when it comes in the update loop, what's going to happen is it's going to come here. It's going to say, hey, game over is false, but the not of false is true. So that means this if statement will pass, okay? And it will start running this code, okay? So for as long as the actual value of game over is false, okay, this update loop will run just as it did before. The only time when we have missed 3 zombies and now game over is switched to true, this statement here will become false and therefore none of this logic will run. So if this logic does not run, we know that it's time to end our game. So if I save here, if I jump back into Unity just to quickly check, and let's increase the speed to 2 just so we can see this happen a little bit quickly. And if I hit play now, let's see. That's 1, that's 2, that's our 3rd guy, and boom, it's time for game over, and there's no more of anything happening basically. So nothing in our game is happening. At this point we can show a game over screen and so on and so forth. Okay guys, so I think we've made a lot of progress in this video. I think this is a good time to have a quick break, and I'll see you on the other side. Hey everybody, welcome back to a brand new video, and in this video we're going to be continuing off from where we left off. In the last video we essentially did all of the setup for our UI, or most of it rather, and today we're going to look at how we can sort of, wire the UI up with our code, okay? So essentially what we need is we need references to these hearts, we need references to this text in our code, and we're going to do that a little bit similar to how we had done it before. So I'm going to go into my game manager, and the game manager once again is acting essentially as sort of like our brain for the game. It is aware of everything. It's aware of our score, it's aware of our number of lives, and so on and so forth. So this just seems like a logical place to take care of it. In a bigger game, you might want to drop in, essentially break stuff down into different, more specific classes, like a UI manager class, just because there's so much, but in this case, that's okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a couple of public variables, and I'm going to call it public image, and I'll say life 01. Now notice, not image conversion, but image. Notice when I do that, Visual Studio is not immediately going to recognize this as a type, and the reason for that is because we need to make some imports. So going all the way up here on the top, what I need to do is we need to do using Unity engine.ui, okay? And once we go ahead and do that, you'll notice how this becomes green, which is great, okay? What this means though is if I quickly save and if I tab on over back to Unity, and once Unity's had a chance to load, notice how over here our game manager script, just like it was looking, just like it was listening for, zombies, and we could drag and drop them in. We can also drag and drop our lives, essentially icons. So for example, what I could do is I could go ahead and do something like this, and now we have a reference to our image, and we can toggle it on and off, essentially. So what we're going to be doing, like we talked about, is essentially just turning these off and on, and that's going to create the effect of essentially losing a life. Okay, so going back to my code, I can go ahead and do that a couple of more times. So I can go ahead and do this, and I can go ahead and do this. I can change this to life 02 and life 03, and now we have references to each of our lives. We'll also get a reference to our text, basically, because we're going to need to update that as well. So score text, let's go ahead and say switch on over and drag and drop all of these into the inspector, okay? So going on to my game manager, and notice over here we've got all these empty fields, so we'll go ahead and fill them up, heart 2, heart 3, and score text, okay? And now in doing so, we can actually access these fields, or these essentially elements in our code. Okay. So the first thing that we can really quickly do is wire up the score text. Okay, so every time that we smash essentially an enemy, we call this function from our input class, and this is where we were increasing our score. Okay, so as soon as we have increased our score, we can think about how we can update the UI. So essentially, we can say score text dot text. So score text dot text allows us to actually set the text value of that text field. Okay, and what we can do is we can say zombie smashed. Okay, and zombie smashed is actually an integer, and we're going to put it in this text field. So what we can do is we can say, hey, convert this to a string, and therefore it fits really well into this text box. Okay, so if I save now, essentially, and if I jump back, I'm going to go ahead and get rid of this debug line as well, since we don't need it anymore. And if I jump back into Unity, and if I give it a second to load, notice how it's starting off at 99 because that's just what we set it as, but now it seems to be actually updating as we want. So what we want to do is we don't want this to essentially start at 99, so we can do a couple of things. First of all, we can just go in the score text and we can by default set this to 0. And since we've already changed it over here, just for good measure, what we can do is we can switch on back to our code, and we can go all the way up here. And actually in our start, right, where we initialize zombie smashed, we can also say, hey, score text dot text is equals to zombies smashed dot toString. And we know that at this point in time in the code, when the game first starts, zombie smashed is 0, so it will automatically programmatically set it to 0. So if you now switch back, and even if this number here is something else and it's not 0, then it should still programmatically change it to 0. If I hit play now, just to quickly test and see if everything is working, and so far so good. Alright, so now we've taken care of the score part. What we now need to think about doing is how we can essentially update our life. Alright, so to update our life, what we're going to do is notice this part here is following is where we were essentially reducing our lives. Okay, so what I'm going to do is we're going to write some code here, which is going to update the UI. Now, since we're going to be doing UI code here, it's just probably better if we create a new function instead of just dumping all of that UI code in here, so just so that our update function doesn't look too cluttered as it already does. Okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new function, and we can call this private void update life UI, and what we can do is we will then call this function over here. Okay. Furthermore, we will essentially do this game over check in our function, so we don't necessarily need it here, so we can just get rid of it here, and over here we can say, hey, call the update life UI function. Okay, so now we can start thinking about what sort of stuff we actually want to do in this function, and that is essentially we want to disable and enable those images. Okay, so what I'm going to do is we can do an if condition, and depending on the number of lives that we have remaining, we can essentially decide what UI state needs to display. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in here and I'm going to say, hey, if lives remaining is equal 3. Okay, now to be honest, in this function, the first time that it comes here, it's already going to have life being reduced to 2. So it's never actually really going to be 3, but just for good measure, in case somehow we end up here with life remaining being 3, the game doesn't like essentially just break or collapse. So just to prevent a crash, we're going to go ahead and write that statement down. And similarly, what we can do is we can copy this and we can say, hey, when life remaining is equal to 2, 1, and 0. So, okay, 2, 1, and 0. Okay, and you can imagine that this here is game over, essentially. So the part where we did about, setting the game over boolean, we can say game over is now equals to true. So now we have that part in there. Okay. Now what we can do is we can use these references to these images and we can enable and disable them. Okay. So if life remaining equals to 3, then what we want is essentially all 3 of these to be enabled. Okay. So if I switch back, what that looks like is we can say life01 dot game object dot set active equals true. Okay. Now at the start of the game, we're going to by default have all of them active. Okay. So this is just if something is active and you make it active again, it remains active. Okay. So we can go ahead and just copy this and we can say, hey, we want all 3 of our lives to be essentially visible there. Okay. Now when we come here and we lose our first life, I'm going to copy paste all 3 of these. What we want is we want this third life to then become inactive. Okay, so essentially what we want is part number 3 to become inactive. Okay. Now notice how I'm unchecking this in the inspector. The way to do that essentially in code is by setting active to false. So what I can do is I can say like03.gameObject.setActive equals false. Okay. Once again, we can copy this and we can say, hey, if life remaining equals to 1, then we want to set the second one from the right false. And lastly, if we have 0 life, then not only do we want to be game over, but we want to set all of our parts to false. Okay? Okay, so really quickly, let's go over what we just did. We created a new function and we called it previously every time after we reduce our life. And this function is in fact responsible for updating the UI for our lives. And we said, hey, every time I come in here, I will check. Every time I come in here, basically, what that means is it's time for me to update the UI. And the way I'm going to do that is I'm just going to look at what my life remaining variable is. I'm going to look at the value, and depending on that value, I'm going to update the UI. Okay, so if I quickly switch over, and if we play the game now, let's see what happens. Okay, so my score seems to be working. Now let's see what happens when we miss a few. Alright, we lose a life, we lose a second one, and now we should lose the third one. And now it's game over. Okay, so everything so far is coming along pretty good. What we want to do now though is that we want to have some sort of a game over screen so that the user knows that the game has ended, because right now the game is just stuck. So we want to give the user a way to essentially be able to restart our game and play again. Okay, so the way we're going to create a restart button is essentially going to be, we'll go on canvas, we'll right click, and we'll look for a UI button. Okay, and this is essentially a button. If I hit the game, if I hit the play button now, you'll notice that the button is just lying there and I can click on it and obviously nothing happens. Okay, so the first thing that we want to do is inside this button there is this text. As you can see, if I disable it, it goes away. We don't really necessarily need this text at the moment, so we're going to go ahead and delete it, okay? Furthermore, we want the restart button to be big, and it's already in the center of the screen, but we want it to be big. So we're going to go ahead and increase the width to about, 400, and we can make the height to about 300, so it takes up a big chunk of our space, okay? Similar to our images, the button also has an image component or an image script attached to it, and at the moment it's using this empty sort of white sprite. So if we go over into our resources folder, we have a game over button, and we can go ahead and drag and drop that in here. So this is this right here is the game over sort of button sprite. I can drag it and I can put it here in like so. Okay, and this is what our game over button looks like. Once again, if I hit play now, it's always going to be there and our game will be in the background. Obviously, we don't want that, but this is what it looks like. So what we can do is we can go ahead and disable this button like so, and we can call this the game over button. Okay? Okay, so now that we have our game over button, the reason why we disabled it is because we don't want it to be showing all the time. But when the game finishes, we can activate it, okay? And you might already know how we're going to do that. So what I'm going to do is I'll go over to our scripts, and once again, we'll create a new public field, okay? And we can call this public button game over button, okay? I'm going to save, and I'm going to switch back to Unity, okay? I'm going to give Unity a second to load. And now in my game manager, I see that it's waiting for me to put in a button here. So I can go ahead and drag and drop my button like so, okay? Okay, so now when I switch on back over to my code, what I can do is back here, when we were calling game over, what we can do is we can say game over button dot set active, or rather game object dot set active true. And if I save, and if I go back to Unity, and if I give it a second to load, if I now hit play, everything should be working according to the plan. Okay, we lose 2 life, and now, boom, you see the game over button. Now, of course, clicking the button doesn't do anything at this point, but this is going to be a great stopping point. So, thank you so much, everybody. Great work, and I will see you in the next video. Hey everybody, and welcome back to a brand new video. And in the last video we stopped off at the game over button, and before we get into scene management, restarting the scene, going to the main menu, one of the things that I really quickly wanted to do was I wanted to make our game a little bit more tricky and a little bit more harder, because at the moment it's a bit slow, it's a bit bland, and it's really easy to just keep smashing the zombies. So what I want to do is I want to add something like as the game progresses it gets harder and harder, and the way we're going to do that is essentially by increasing the speed with which these zombies rise. So we'll have a score, right? And we already have a score here. So what we'll do is every time the score increases by a certain amount, we'll increase the rise speed by a little bit. And then when it increases again, the score, then we will increase the rise speed again and again. And this is pretty typical of a lot of casual games, that the more you play, the harder the game becomes, okay? So over here in my game manager, just for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to go ahead and make the rise speed 1 for now, and we can tweak this and see what the best rise speed for us is. And I'll go ahead and switch on over to our code. So over here in the game manager, let's create a new function, and that function will be responsible for increasing the speed with which the zombies spawn. So let's call this, we'll call it private void increase spawn speed. And over here we are essentially going to be increasing the speed of the zombies. So what we want to do is we want to check, hey, is the score above a certain threshold? So let's go ahead and scroll all the way to the top, and let's create a new variable, and we'll call this public, and we'll make it public so that we can set the threshold from the inspector. And let's see, public integer, and we'll call this score threshold, and by default we'll give this 5, okay? So we'll say when the score hits 5, we are going to increase the speed, okay? So coming over here, what we're going to do is something like so. We'll say, hey, if zombie smashed is anything greater than or equal to my score threshold, okay? So if the number of zombies I've smashed is actually greater than my score threshold, what I want to do is I want to increase the speed with which they rise, okay? So that's rise speed plus plus. And now I want to create a new score threshold. Now, it just depends on how you want to increase that threshold, right? You could say, hey, you know, the next threshold should be at 10, and then the next one should be at 15, increasing by 5. But for me, what I wanted to do was I wanted to double the threshold every single time. So the first time, if you kill 5 zombies, that's when the speed increases, but then the next time you have to do 10, and then 20, and 40, and so on and so forth. So in my case, what I'm going to do is score threshold times equals 2. And if you're confused about these shorthands, we'll just quickly discuss them. So rise speed, and we've talked about this before, any integer plus plus essentially means you add 1 to it. So this is the same thing as saying rise speed equals rise speed plus 1, okay? And over here, score threshold time equals 2 essentially means score threshold equals score threshold times 2. So that would be something like score threshold equals score threshold times 2. And these are essentially just shorthands that you will see so commonly that it's just easier to become familiar with it and get in the habit of using these. Okay, so what we're doing here is essentially we're checking, hey, is the score increased past a certain threshold? And if it has, then increase the speed and update the threshold. So now we need to think about, hey, where exactly are we going to be calling this function? And it's a no-brainer. Every time we kill an enemy, that's where we're updating the score. So naturally in the kill enemy function, it just seems like a good place to be essentially using this function. So right after I increase my zombie count, what I can do is, hey, I can check and see if I need to increase my speed. So I can just say increase speed and like so. Okay, now what I'll do is, if we've done everything correctly, switch on over back to Unity and see if everything's working. Okay, so back in Unity, I'm going to give Unity a second to load. And once it's ready, notice how we have this public field exposed here, score threshold. And the reason why this is also nice to make it public is not only can we actually change the score threshold from here, we can also actually see a change in the inspector. So if I hit the play button now, and if we keep an eye over here on the rise speed, after my score goes to 5, this rise speed should double, essentially. So boom, notice the score threshold is now 10. If I reach my score as 10, then the rise speed will increase once again. Notice now it's 3, and you can already see that these guys are going pretty fast. So you can essentially just tweak this as per your own requirements, and once again the speed has now increased. So this is looking really well. Our game is a little bit more challenging now, and I think this is a good stopping point, and I will see you in the next video. Hey everybody, and welcome back to a brand new video. So our game is coming along really well. We've got most of the things in place. Today what we want to do is we want to quickly take care of our main menu. So I'm going to go ahead and go over to my main menu scene, and this is essentially what we want to take care of. Now the things that we're going to do in this scene we already know, so we're going to quickly just get them out of the way. We already know how to do everything, so it should be pretty straightforward. So what we want to do is, first of all, we want to add a background, and we also want to add a button which we can click on, which will start our game essentially. So we can start by going here into the hierarchy, and we can right click, we can do a UI, and we can do a button. Okay, now we have this button, and what we're going to do is every time this button is clicked, essentially, this is going to actually start our game. Now, like before, we don't need this text here, so we can go ahead and get rid of this text. And what we can do is we can make this button a full screen button, okay? The way we're going to do this is that, notice how it's already centered at 0, 0, 0. If it's not, you can click here and you can reset it. And it goes ahead and also makes it a square, but that's not really important at the moment. And what we can do is, essentially, if I click here, if I click on this here, if I hold down Shift, and in doing so, essentially, I'm setting the anchors to all of these 4 edges. So if I go over here in my scene view, we can see that the anchors of this button are all the way over here. If I now go ahead and make all of this 0, 0, 0, 0, and 0, you notice how it takes care of all of our screen. So if I switch over to the game view, essentially this is all you see, which is awesome. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to call this the main menu button, or let's say, yeah, we'll call it the main menu button. And we can go ahead and add in a sprite there. So going over to our resources folder, and we can go ahead and add this image as the sprite. So going over to main menu, over here in the image script, we can drag and drop this like so. If I hit play now, you can see that we have our button. Of course, we need to still wire it up, but it looks awesome. Okay, so like before, in order to wire up the transition for this button, we need to give it a game object, okay, here, and then we can call a function from code. In order to do that, we need a new script, because our previous script, the game manager script, was in the other scene. So we can quickly go over to our scripts folder and create a new script. Right-click, create C# script, and we'll call this main script, okay? Now, we need this script to be on a game object in the scene, and since we know that the camera is going to be in the scene anyways, I'm going to go ahead and drag and drop this script onto our main camera, okay? We can also come here and add component, and we could look for main menu script. Now that we have our main menu script, we can double click it, open it in Visual Studios, and start actually creating the function. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to say public void onClicked, and I'm just going to give it a generic name. And over here, we're essentially going to write the code that will transition from the main menu to the game scene. Now, once again, we've done this before, so we will have to import scene management. So using Unity engine .scene management. Once we have done that, it is as simple as saying scene manager .load scene, and we know the index of our game scene is index number 1, and that's the index that I'm going to put in there. Now, if I go back onto Unity, just for a quick refresher, you can see what the index of your scenes are by going here in File and Build Settings, and over here it tells you essentially what the index is, and I want to open the sample scene, which is where the rest of our game is happening. Probably we should have called this and given this a more meaningful name earlier on, but that's okay right now since we only have 2 scenes. Now I can go in my main menu button, I can drag and drop my main camera on here, and on my camera I can look for the main menu script. Inside this main menu script, I can look for the onClick function. Okay, so now if I hit the play button, and if I now click on this screen here, it actually starts our game. So 1, and we can start popping our zombies, and essentially, if I go here, if I quickly speed them up a little bit, and when the game over screen comes up, I can go on my main menu, I can click here, restart the game. So everything is coming along really well. We actually have a complete game, guys. So congratulations, this is the bare bones, and we have gone through a long set of process, and we've actually set up the game from start to finish. So good job, guys, and this is going to be a short and quick video, but I just wanted to say congratulations, and I will see you later.